Travel is more than just ticking off countries. It's about the people, the culture, the food, the moments. I'm Pippa Hudson, and on Wonder the World, I invite you to join me every week as we explore destinations both near and far, with the help of fellow adventurers who share their unique travel stories. Listen to my podcast wherever you get them.
The Clement Manyathela Show on 702, live from the US, with the latest updates from the SA and US meeting. Let's walk the talk.
So I want us to start off this hour with a conversation that I had with a gentleman by the name of Daniel Runde, quite an influential fellow here in Washington, D.C. As I said to you in the first hour, I met this man when I had breakfast with the former ambassador, former U.S. ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Brigetti. I had breakfast with him at the Metropolitan Club. That's really where the who's and who's in politics here in D.C. go. And I met some really significant politicians there, some of whom I spoke to off the record just to get context of what the situation is and what kind of environment we could be walking into. And I say we, but I'm referring to the South African government. And I spoke to some Republicans, I spoke to some Democrats, I spoke to some lawmakers, and there are some of them, of course, that didn't want to speak on the record, but they gave us really they gave me valuable information that's really guided what I've been able to share with you so far. So listen to this gentleman, Daniel Runde. He is a Republican. He has served in the Bush administration. He has served in President Trump's first term. He has played a critical role in, some of the Africa trade, the trade that exists between the U.S. and Africa. And I had a conversation with him yesterday because I wanted you to get a sense of what I was hearing here in Washington, D.C., coming from the Republicans and also coming from the Democrats. So take a listen to how this conversation went. And afterwards, I'm going to play you a conversation I also had yesterday with the Minister of International Relations, Ronald Lamola.
What are your thoughts about South Africa's presence here in Washington, D.C. for that meeting with President Trump? How do you see it?
So I've been a champion of U.S.-Africa relations for a long time. I was one of the architects of Prosper Africa. I testified last year in front of the U.S. Congress in favor of renewing AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. I was one of the architects of the Development Finance Corporation creation, which has helped Africa and supported business ties with U.S. investment in Africa. And I was also very involved with getting the Export-Import Bank of the United States reauthorized after a 5-year hiatus, and I chaired the Sub-Saharan Africa Advisory Committee for the Export-Import Bank during the first Trump administration. So I'm a friend of Africa. I think that I believe that the African continent with 2 billion people in the very near future and 40% of the workforce in the very near future is going to be a big part of the future of the United States. So we need to pay more attention to Africa. Having said all of that, our relations with South Africa, one of the largest countries on the continent, is at an absolute low. It's at a historic low. There are literally South Africa has almost no friends in Washington today. The government of South Africa has 0 friends in Washington. Nobody will stand up for this. Our relationship with South Africa is at an absolute low. Of course, apartheid was a terrible evil in the world. And of course, that Nelson Mandela was a historic and inspiring fault. There are very few people under the age of 40 in the United States that remembers Nelson Mandela or remembers the apartheid regime or has any historic memory of it. So let me describe it as extra goodwill that South Africa enjoyed because of this historic wrong has dissipated. And so especially I'm going to just list some of the problems. One is that we are spending something like $700 million a year on medicines for South Africa, while at the same time South Africa is at the front of and in the lead on prosecuting Israel in the ICC, has gone out of its way to do military exercises with the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians. There have been accusations that South Africa has exported weapons to Russia. there's very little tolerance for this in Washington. Your ambassador, the South African ambassador of the United States, basically cannot get a meeting with anybody of any seriousness in Washington. I think the South African ambassador had a meeting with like an intern at the State Department, something along those lines. I also think the fact that he was persona non grata, meaning kicked out of the country, should be a message to South Africa that there's very little tolerance, there's very little patience, there's very little goodwill. So as a result, the sorts of decisions that the South African government has made has isolated, in my view, South Africa is on its way to becoming a really big version of Zimbabwe. And so, I think we need to care about Africa. We need to care about the African continent. But I also don't think we have to give South Africa a pass for every bad foreign policy decision that they make. I think that the president of South Africa's visit to Washington is extremely high risk. I have no idea how much preparation has gone into it. I'm betting not much. And it could easily be a Zelensky 2.0, if you all remember what happened to President Zelensky. I hope it's not televised because I don't think it's going to be good for President Ramaphosa. The president leads a government that, it's not clear to me how often he experiences a lot of criticism. I think that I'm worried that the meeting between President Ramaphosa and President Trump is very high risk. I don't know how much preparation has gone into it. I worry that given sort of the significant concerns that the United States has with South Africa, given sort of the deterioration of the relationship, it's quite a high-risk move for President Ramaphosa to visit Washington. President Trump is somebody who likes to broker deals. It's not clear to me what President Ramaphosa is offering and what changes in policy he's going to be offering, given sort of the situation I described previously.
There's often been an explanation from the South African government, for instance, on the issue of arms to Russia, that's never happened. They did an investigation and said that's a lie. On the issue of genocide as well, around the white Afrikaners. How is that clarification finding ground here in DC?
It has zero ground. Nobody believes the government. No one believes the government. For example, my understanding is there's some song called "Kill the Boers" or something like this. So
by an opposition party, right?
Anyways, my point is there's been some sort of there seems to be my point is that there seems to be. This government does not enjoy a lot of credibility in Washington. Doesn't have a lot of friends. No one's standing up for it. This is a moment for the government of South Africa has to decide: well, do they want to be allied with Russia and China and Iran, which they seem to be, or do they want to be allied with the West? And they clearly seem to have chosen the former rather than the latter. Like I said, there's not a lot of goodwill. There's not a lot of trust, and like I said, I think the South Africa has to decide whether it wants to be a bigger version of Zimbabwe or a bigger, and so the government can say whatever it wants, but I don't think it's falling on deaf ears here.
Yeah. What do you think is what the Trump administration wants from South Africa? What would you say the 2 or 3 things that would make President Trump happy in that meeting if South Africa makes concessions to?
Yeah. Okay. First, if I was President Ramaphosa, I would say we, the South African government, are going to pick up the tab for the HIV/AIDS medicine. I don't know if it's $700 million a year or $800 million a year, but the United States has been funding South Africa's some of HIV/AIDS medicine for 20 years. South Africa's a big country and a relatively wealthy country. It can afford to pay for its own medicine. South Africa ought to say we're going cold turkey on spending thank you very much, America, for 20 years of spending $700 million a year, billions of dollars, and said we're going to pick up the tab starting immediately. Second, we're going to cease our purchases of Russian and Chinese weapons, and we're going to purchase them from alternate partners. Could be Turkey, could be Israel, could be somebody. Third, we're going to cease and desist on the lead in the prosecution on the ICC. So I would say those are and then if the South African government wants to have a conversation about minerals, that's of great interest to the United States. But I just think that There is a very limited, there's the goodwill that I think South Africans have assumed especially in the United States and in parts of Europe because of the historic wrongs of the apartheid regime. I think those have dissipated. I think that they are now seen as part of history, not a part of the present. So relying on that is a mistake. And I worry that I think a number of actors depend on that. And it was a terrible wrong, but President Mandela left the government of South Africa in 1999. So that was a very long time ago. And so now we have a situation where when policymakers read anything about South Africa, it's always a headache. It's always a provocation or a headache. If we got the partnership right, we could have a shared prosperity agenda with South Africa that would also have meaning, I think, for the entire southern part of the continent. I also think one of the things we should think about is maybe President Ramaphosa ought to come forward with a couple of big, major win-win projects between the United States and Africa that are commercial in nature. Let me suggest one. I think that I'd love to see the United States take the lead on building Inga 3, the major dam in the Congo that I think has the potential to power as many as 10 countries, and I believe including South Africa. So maybe President Ramaphosa ought to come to the conversation with one or two major swing for the fences legacy projects that President Trump and the African leaders could work on together, where the United States can sell goods and services. I think we need to think beyond traditional foreign aid. Yeah. And so I think South Africans and Africans see the continent as a business opportunity. Instead, what we have, oftentimes I think we have a 10 or 20 or 30 year out of date picture in our minds about the African continent. And we get a lot of negative press in the English language press about the African continent. And so it's not a totally fair, and I agree, it's sometimes a distorted picture. But I think President Ramaphosa should be coming forward with some big win-win projects that would include American jobs and American companies, how they could benefit. Okay. And think about what those are. Because I think that's, when I meet African leaders and I meet African entrepreneurs, they're thinking about business. And we in the United States are behind the curve. We need to understand that Africa is an enormous business opportunity and it is going to be the continent of the future. And we're not fully there yet. So in some ways we need to be educated. And so I think President Ramaphosa, if he handles the meeting correctly, could help educate President Trump and his team about the enormous business opportunities. There's a number of people on President Trump's team who understand this. But I think if it was described to President Trump as a big win for American businesses and American workers, that's the way to approach it, as opposed to we need another 5 years of foreign assistance to pay for the HIV/AIDS meds. I think that's an old model, and frankly, it's not. I don't think like I said, the South African government can afford to pay for medicine. They should be doing so.
Yeah.
So that's the conversation I had with Daniel Runde, a Republican here in DC. He served in the Bush administration, served in Trump's first term. And I thought he sort of represents the views of a lot of Republicans, which is Donald Trump's party. Now, you will hear him in that clip. He speaks about the issue of HIV and AIDS medicine. They know that PEPFAR wasn't necessarily funding our HIV and 100% of our HIV and AIDS medication. They know that very well, and we spoke about this even before we started recording. But they don't really care about the facts. And that's precisely the point I'm making to you through playing this clip to you. They spoke about even the issue of South Africa supplying arms to Russia to fight in Ukraine. They mentioned it before we started doing the recording. And I said, but our government has done an investigation, and that investigation said that the ambassador, Bridget Hugh, was lying. And they don't care about that. They still believe it. Their response was, well, we don't trust your government. So even on the issue of refugees, it's the same thing. That is why President Donald Trump keeps on repeating that there's a genocide, even when there are people, who have consistently tried to explain that that is not the case. There's a tweet from one of our listeners who said to me, let me try find it for you. I found it so fascinating. Who said, Clement, the U.S. This is Tau on Twitter. Says Clement, the U.S. is a self-aware bully. If the U.S. has advanced technology in terms of infiltration and espionage, yet they are so ill-informed and they still believe fake news, then America is a problem. And that's precisely the issue, isn't it? There are people here who are smart enough, who read, who have been told what the facts are, and yet they still choose to believe that somehow the U.S. has been paying for our HIV medication. They still believe that the U.S. has been, the South African government has been killing or persecuting white Afrikaners. They believe that the South African government did, in fact, give arms to Russia to go and fight in Ukraine.